Maria Wheatley is a second-generation dowser and geomancer and one of the world's leading authorities on geodetic earth energies, ley lines and grid lines. In her new book, The Secret History of Stonehenge, Maria takes you on a worldwide megalithic odyssey. She reveals the two types of Neolithic longskulled people, demonstrates and proves how earth energies were employed in seed enhancement and the planting of crops to boost yields, and shares her discovery of a rare astronomical event that brought the ultimate end to the megalithic culture. Hello and welcome to my new channel, The Esoteric Explorer. In this episode, I'm hugely honoured and very excited to be joined once again by my favourite megalithic researcher, Maria Wheatley, who has recently released her new book, The Secret History of Stonehenge. So, without further ado, hello Maria, how are you?
Very well, thank you for having me back, Paul. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, it's a pleasure for me. So, you've got this new book out, which I'm very excited to read. The first thing I noticed about it was the cover, which is absolutely gorgeous. It's a really beautiful picture on the front. So I'll let you get started. So what exactly is the secret history of Stonehenge?
The Secret History of Stonehenge is the culmination of about 8 years research. It's a book that's got 390 pages and about 270 illustrations. And it covers the Neolithic period of the longskulled people, trepanning. I have a new take on trepanning, for example, which was a form of surgery in the Neolithic. And I look at numerous different types of monuments that the Neolithic created. And then I move on to have a look at what do we really know about Stonehenge and the way it looked? And I found in my research a massive buried stone setting. I discovered that the royal family had stolen one of the stones from Stonehenge and that it didn't look like what we're spoon-fed, for one. And I present a lot of archaeological evidence for this, for instance. And then I move on to a different culture that are called giants by some. They were very tall by the Neolithic standard, and I explore their culture. In my research of Stonehenge, I was flabbergasted that nobody had logged out who was put into the barrows, as in what type of people, what status were they. So I looked at every single burial around Stonehenge, Avebury, Derbyshire, Staffordshire, it goes on to where I looked. And I realized they were burying the shaman and the high priest in a completely different manner to anybody else. So I discovered all of their artifacts, what they looked like, what they wore, and what was being done inside of Stonehenge as well. I found evidence for Bronze Age runestones. They are identical to the Viking runestones as well. So I give a different take on what was being done within Stonehenge and some other monuments beside. And then I go on to cover sacred geometry as well, and the different types of sacred geometry that were used in temples like the Sphinx Temple, Stonehenge, Avebury, Orkney as well. I had a fantastic tutor, the late Richard Cardrew, which I always like to respectfully remember and honor for his part. Then I explore different aspects of the culture itself and why did the megalithic culture end in the manner that it did? Why did it suddenly stop? And I realized with the help of an astronomer, it was because of a very strange and eerie astronomical event that occurred. And literally from that moment forth, no other stone structure was ever built.
Okay. When did this astronomical event happen?
I think it was around 1100 BC. I mean, the archaeologists give a random date of 1500 BC for the end of the megalithic culture, mainly due because that was dated from Stonehenge, what's known as the Z and the Y stones. which were never completed. It was a kind of an abandoned aspect of Stonehenge. So they used that 1500 as a blanket date for the rest of the British Isles. I disagree with that. I think it continued, as there's evidence for, at Avebury and other sites, and conclude that this date was because of this celestial event in the heavens. And it would have been breathtakingly strange for those people. They'd probably never seen it before.
So
And the priesthood was buried after that with all of their artifacts, every single artifact. It was like that was the end of the megalithic priesthood. And we know that was around 1200 to 1100 BC.
right, okay, this is news to me. This is very interesting. So what type of event was it that ended the megalithic era so abruptly?
We must remember that ancient sites like Stonehenge, and I discovered lunar events and a solar event at Avebury as well, that it was governed by the cycles of the moon. For example, at Stonehenge, it was the moon's metonic cycle. When the moon was at mid-swing, it would rise above the tapering crest of the heelstone, and either side of the henge bank with the heelstone in the middle. That was the moon's metonic cycle. Commonly today, we say it's about the midsummer sunrise and the midwinter sunset. That's only one aspect. But if we look to the moon, for instance, it's far, far more dynamic, because if we go to the original version of Stonehenge and we look at it through the eyes of the people that were there rather than our own eyes, then what would we see rather? What would we see? You have a huge white henge bank, 6 feet tall, surrounding Stonehenge. So you're only seeing the top of the stones. Today, you see all of the stones, for instance. You would have had a limited view. It was a very, very secretive place. But the greater trilithon stands a good 2 feet above the rest of the linteled circle. So if you imagine you've got a linteled circle of 30 standing stones, all dressed into a lozenge shape, and then the greater trilithon, you can't see the other trilithons, creates a slight window above the linteled stone circle. Okay, so you literally see a window, and that's because it captured in an extraordinary event that only happens once every 18.61 years. The moon's most southerly moonset would have been captured in that window. So we realize then it's a lunar monument. So the focus is on the moon and on other celestial constellations beside, especially one that I discovered. But let's focus on the moon. So everything is to do with the lunar event. Even the 56 blue stones of phase 1 was lunar, and I'll reveal to you what the henge was really like later on, because it was spectacular. And I have an eyewitness that was there with Richard Atkinson, who lied to the British people. So we're focusing on the moon at Stonehenge. Within that window, rising above the heelstone, that's at opposite ends of the monument, incidentally, so it was about the moon. And then they would have been able to predict it. According to Gerald Hawkins' research, it was an eclipse predicting monument, and he wrote about that in the 1960s. So let's say he's correct, and it was used to predict eclipses. Well, then that is quite a story, because every time around about the winter solstice, that if there was an eclipse, it would have been blood red above the heelstone.
Wow.
So we're looking at drama. Okay, so that's what they would have been used to, predicting eclipses, and especially around the winter solstice. You think the sunset between the trilithon was spectacular? What about a red moon above the heelstone? I think they have equal qualities, that said. So what ended it? Round about 1100 BC, give or take a window of maybe 50 to 100 years, events that we're experiencing today were experienced in that megalithic culture, and it was the end of the Bronze Age, near enough. And at the moment, we know that Iceland is having a volcanic event. And we know that it's being reported and on the news. Well, during that era of the Bronze Age, there was a huge volcanic explosion from Hekla 3. And Hekla 3 in Iceland means gateway to hell, because when that explodes, you can have potentially a nuclear winter. Okay, temperatures dropped at the end of the Bronze Age rapidly. They could no longer go into stone circles. Everything became damp. The climate changed. But more than that, if you have, for example, an eclipse in that era, which we know, according to Hawkins, he calculated. Well, I looked with the help of an astronomer. I know, let's look at the eclipses of that era. Was there one in occurrence? Obviously at night, because some eclipses occur in the day, and we realized there was. Now, if that is correct, and we think it is, and there was Hekla explosion as well, you have a very rare event called the Black Moon, the night of the Black Moon. And that's when it no longer goes the color that you're used to seeing, that coppery color of an eclipse, a gray mist, because there's a lot of dust in the atmosphere, okay? And so it doesn't change the same color as what you're used to. It goes gray and then it goes black. That's what they would have seen from Stonehenge. So instead of predicting the normal eclipse that they were used to seeing, suddenly the black eclipse occurs. And like I say, it's a rare event. You have to have a lot of debris and dust in the atmosphere. And certainly Hekla 3 would have done that. We know it was Iceland and not Santorini now, because if you go onto the internet, some people report it was an event in Greece. Around the Med, but no, we don't, because when you start analyzing soil debris and things like that, you can go to source now quite easily, and now we know that was Iceland and it wasn't an event in the Mediterranean.
So how long would this have lasted, this event?
Death and destruction followed. Because it was a sudden event that made, in a way, a nuclear winter, the temperature we know dropped dramatically by a degree. Now, once you have that soon and sudden drop, then food sources literally dry up. And what was happening is, around about Stonehenge area and far besides, they were abandoning those areas because they became boggy, they became quite wet. Tree rings stopped growing for 10 years around that time of an event. And this is in the archaeological record, by the way. You could look this up yourselves. And then they headed for the hills because the hills became better dry land. And so you had the cultural change from the late Bronze Age into the Iron Age ceremonial hill forts, which they now know were ceremonial and not just fortified. They were fortified in the Roman era. So farmsteads were abandoned, people were abandoned, the priesthood was probably abandoned, because we know that they were buried with every single one of their artifacts, which was gold and lush objects as well. Now, if you're poor as society, you'd have taken that, but they didn't want anything to do with that priesthood that didn't predict this. And then the burial practices and ritual sacrifice comes into the story at the late Bronze Age as well, that never happened in the Neolithic or Bronze Age. It was a terrible time for those people as well. There was starvation and probably disease as well. And they abandoned the way that they celebrated the festival dates by creating more events, oddly enough, like Glastonbury Festival today, in fields with thousands of people. They're called midden sites, but they're not refuge sites, as in midden rubbish. They're these vast festival sites where they were consuming a lot of food and indeed alcohol as well at those times.
Wow, what a fantastic start. Yeah, I had no idea about this at all. So that's
Nobody has. It's unique research that I've done, because when I was studying at Oxford, Paul, and when I've been studying with Bob Clark at Wessex Archaeology, one question I always had for the archaeological community was, why did it suddenly end?
Mm.
Why did it end?
Mm.
And nobody really had that. They knew that there was probably starvation. They knew the temperature had dropped. They knew the facts that I've told you rather, but they didn't think about the eclipse predicting qualities of some of the sites that would have predicted something. And that's what I think brought the priesthood down.
Wow. Okay. Right. So let's just take it back to Stonehenge phase one. Okay. So I was reading one of your articles today and I was surprised to learn that you're dating phase one of Stonehenge to 3100 BC. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's University College London that actually ascertained that date.
Right. Okay. How did they go about doing that? Do you know?
Well,
I say this because many researchers in your field date Stonehenge and other sites quite a long way back prior to 3100 BC.
mm,
So is that a date that you go along with yourself?
no, it's an orthodox date
You're right.
because of artifacts. They have got some really good dating techniques now, and I can actually give you evidence for Silbury Hill to be equal date as the oldest monuments in Turkey, going back to 12,000 BC, and I can give some really good evidence for that. But at Stonehenge, what the policy is when you go to the bottom of a stone, that's where it's in the chalk bedrock, and any artifact beneath that that it's used to date it. That's
Mm.
how that dating is. So at Stonehenge, Professor Tim DeVille and the late Geoffrey Wainwright, excellent archaeologists who were doing an excavation on the Bluestone section of Stonehenge, discovered two pieces of carbon. Well, that's a holy grail to an archaeologist because they can get carbon-14 dating, from which they got 2500 BC to 3000 BC to 8000 BC, and they chose the latter date because it fitted more in with the model of Stonehenge. But today what they're using is called optical stimulated luminescence, and that's much more accurate than carbon-14. It's when you go to that old surface level, you know, if you go down in this area about a meter, you'll hit the Romans. If you go down much further, you'll hit the Neolithic. It's called the old surface level. And so they put in like a probe, if you will, with like a camera on, and they test the last time that piece of land saw daylight. And that's how they can now get more of an accurate dating system. Stonehenge hasn't been done on OSL, but that's what they're going to be using in the future.
Right. Okay. Brilliant. So let's go back, as I say, to the first phase of Stonehenge. Who were the builders?
The builders of Stonehenge Phase 1 were the elongated, longskulled people, and there's a lot of evidence for that because the long barrows were contemporary to Stonehenge Phase 1 and Phase 2 alike, and we see the remains of their skeletons there. But what did Stonehenge Phase 1 look like? If we imagine, just like I mentioned earlier, a very high chalk bank, okay, with a ditch, and then another chalk bank. So the bank is on the inside at Stonehenge, which actually makes it not a henge at all, because a henge is the ditch on the inside and the bank on the outside. But when Professor Richard Atkinson, was doing an excavation there, the 1950s, of the henge bank of Stonehenge, and it's just a bump in the ground today, it's not the 6-foot wonder that it used to be, he noticed one thing, and that it was cut out of the solid chalk bedrock to make it look more like a pudding bowl. So it was cut out like that.
Mm-hmm.
But he informed the British nation that it was just chalk rubble. Tom Gorey, enter my excellent eyewitness, and this is from my legacy archives of notes on Stonehenge by master dowsers, geomancers, and archaeologists that I've inherited from my late father. Tom Gorey was the curator and guide to Stonehenge. He was the custodian of the site for 25 years. And his voice was respected, hence he was allowed in on the dig. He saw that and said, you know, this is incredible. It looks like it's cut out to form this kind of pudding bowl. But that was written out of every single piece of information by Richard Atkinson.
Why?
But you're talking about something looking so pristine, so polished that it covers 800 feet. What sort of technology would be used for that? And they're saying antlers, wedging out pieces of chalk. And that's the model. If you go to the Stonehenge site today and you go to the museum there and the visitor centre, it's a big site just down the road from Stonehenge, you have a huge section on all of the tools used to build Stonehenge and their antlers. So suddenly Atkinson was probably faced with, well, it's now the actual huge henge is up to 800 feet in diameter. It's not the kind of little bit, this is Stonehenge phase 1, which went into Stonehenge phase 2. And so that was the big question. But like I say, Tom Gorey, he was the custodian of the monument. And he also, as I put in Secret History of Stonehenge, rather, get your title of your own book right, Maria. Does help. He also noticed that the Ministry of Works, because prior to English Heritage, who oversaw Stonehenge? The government, the Ministry of Works. And whilst Tom Gorey was serving there, he saw the Ministry of Works defacing some of the trilithons. And that's written out of the history books. And when I started to piece together the facts about Stonehenge and what the government was doing and the cover-ups about it, that's why I called it the secret history, because it's been kept secret for half a century, or if not more.
But why has it been so important for them to keep it secret?
Because it doesn't fit any of the guidebooks. It doesn't fit the model. One stone is
But
stone.
surely, sorry to interrupt, Maria, but if we discover new information, surely we should be using that information and correcting what we already know. So why are they so opposed to doing that?
At that time, in the 1950s, when the excavations were being done, because it then became a UNESCO World Heritage Site in the 80s. But prior to that, it was under the domain of the government and archaeologists like Richard Atkinson. They were the main voice, and it was their interpretation of that. Yes, they knew that certain things weren't happening, but purported a different story, which is basically lying to the people about their monuments. And I think, yes, the truth should have prevailed at that time, because you did have witnesses there at the time that were disagreeing with what was going on. I mean, for example, this is the voice and situation of today. I have been writing for English Heritage guidebooks that for 10 years. I started in 2013 writing guidebooks for English Heritage, Stonehenge Shop. All of my products of books were being sold there, as well as my posters. Each time you have a new publication, you offer it to the sales department of English Heritage. So I offered them, the Secret History of Stonehenge. From that moment forth, it got banned. All of my products were banned. So you're saying about what happened in the 1950s, why wasn't that a voice? Why can't I be a voice today when you've employed me for 10 years to work with you, and now you're trying to silence my voice inside of your own shop? So I think it's ongoing.
Very disappointing. Okay. Let's take it back to the elongated skull people.
Sure.
Where do you think they originated from? Were they related in some way to the Egyptian pharaohs? Were they a global culture? Were they connected to Atlantis at all? I've even heard talk of them being somehow related to the Fae, which I'm a bit incredulous about. But where would you say they came from? Were they from this planet? Were they, from somewhere else in the galaxy?
Well, I actually do link them into the Fae, and I can give you some really good facts about that as being an origins of a myth, not themselves being the Fae. Okay, right. So that's what I've spoken about previously. ADNA, ancient DNA, is a really good source, and the ADNA that came out of the Neolithic period shows that they were quintessentially the ancient Britons that were very similar in, as I discovered, in their burial practices of the Neolithic, identical to ancient Egypt. So we do have this correlation between cultural identity. Okay, let's think of it as a cultural identity, but they are quintessentially ancient British. Why do we know that? Because when you have the aDNA of the Beaker culture, which was from 2500 BC, a very tall, very stout culture that came across from Europe to the British Isles, their DNA is slightly different. In fact, by 2480 BC, according to Professor Ian Barnes, an expert in aDNA analysis, 99.9% of the ancient British DNA gone. Okay. And what he also noticed, which I think is quite an amazing fact, that from the Neolithic influence of the Bronze Age coming in, the Beaker culture, there was no interaction for 500 years with intermarrying. Okay. So no interaction. What was going on in ancient Britain to have these two cultures not interacting? Then what Barnes says is there was a tipping point, and that tipping point led to intermarriage and basically the destruction of ancient British identity. And the elongated skulled people then literally were no more. And we also had a plague around about 2500 BC, attested to by burials, especially around the sort of Derbyshire area, that could have spread further south, like any plague does. It will spread. And so it could have been disease that the Beakers were bringing over as well that destroyed that culture.
Okay, but we do have we have finds of elongated skulls in South America. Brian Forster's done a lot of work on that, and obviously in Egypt as well. But you're saying that the elongated skull people definitely originated in ancient Britain.
They were originally they probably migrated across from the steppes in Russia and also down from Spain as well. That's what the aDNA is suggesting. So they originally came from different places, became isolated on the British Isles around 6000 BC, because you could have walked to the British Isles across Doggerland prior to 6000 BC. And then with the end of the kind of Younger Dryas era, where you had a flood, and then it was the British Channel. So they became an isolated, unique type of culture for the British Isles then. But if you go way, way back, then yes, they would have migrated from quite some distance. But interestingly enough, talking about the Fae, for instance, when you have an elongated skull, the anthropologists were looking into this from the Victorian era right up until about the 1930s. And they kept noticing one thing in report after report. If you've got an elongated skull, their ears, you can't see mine because I've got hair there, but are here. You just have to trust me on that one. Are here, but on an ear back, they're smaller. Their ear placements are different. But more than that, when I first started discussing the elongated skulls of Stonehenge and elsewhere, I only had a skull to go on. Yeah, I photographed a skull at Cambridge and I knew the dimensions of that. I didn't have a full skeleton. After lockdown and during lockdown, I was getting all of the femur bone measurements, arm bone measurements, and building up a skeleton picture of an elongated person. And a strange fact started to emerge. We have our skulls 1/8 of our body proportion. Artists use that, and designers of clothes use these body proportions on modern day people. But in the Neolithic, they had elongated skulls, but there was 1/10 of the body size. So they were longer, but smaller compared to their more longer body shape. So with that very strange body proportion that they had, and like I say, you get this through femur bones, and you can look it up if you know where to go. Then they had the strange ear placement, for instance, and also when I started to look into the makings of the ear with the bones and what makes up the ear, because in one anthropologist report it kept saying they had a different ear bones. We have 3 main bones in our ears. They possibly had 2. So I gave the report to a doctor who's come on tours with me. I mean, she works for A&E in London. I'm not going to say her name. I haven't been permission to say her name, okay? But she looked at those reports and said, this can't be true. And I said, but I'm giving you report after report. If it was, what would be in occurrence. And she said, I can't say because I've never come across this, but it could change their hearing qualities. Maybe they hear infrasound or ultrasound. Who knows? Maybe they couldn't. But why I liken them to the Fae is because I think they had this strange body proportions, different offset ear as well. They had a ridge going down the top of their head that was constantly being reported. And when you look to the myth of Ireland, the two Arthur de Danann, for example, they're the supernatural fey beings, as they kind of looked at it, lost a battle. They had a fight, they'd lost a battle, and then they descended into the mounds and became the Fae. It's a mythology. Now, I think that is from a history long forgotten, but projected onto mythological beings, because the elongated skulled people did look different. If one was by me now, we'd do a double take. Who is that? What is that? So I think the origins of the Fae came from the elongated skulled people and their strange appearance. And I think the origins of giants came from, again, the much taller beaker culture that was dominant afterwards. So I think giants, fae, and pixies, all of which are associated to barrows throughout the British Isles, you have a story from one or the other, is because of the people of the past that were long forgotten.
Okay, wow. So there's a lot of things there that's going off in my head. So these people's ears were different to ours, with 2 bones as opposed to 3. So can we assume from that their hearing would have been different? Because it reminded me of a previous video we did together where you mentioned that you once experienced the Stones, I think it was at Avebury, singing. So
Yeah.
perhaps there's a connection there. I don't know.
I think there is, because when I did some measurements of standing stones going back quite some time now, and thankfully so, I did those measurements then, because today it would be very complicated because of all the electromagnetic interference. Someone switching on their car sends a signal, etc., etc. And at one point we got 18 hertz coming out of the standing stones, and we hear at 20. So I postulate that possibly in the Neolithic, their perception of stones was audible, whereas we today, it's visual. Okay, so I think if it's correct, I mean, we don't know what they could hear. Well, we never will unless tests are done. I doubt very much tests are going to be done on this middle ear principle, because you have to have funding. Even archaeologists will have to have a really good reason for funding, and to say how somebody heard in the Neolithic, I don't think that would be high on their agenda.
Okay. So just going back to the Fae, I've had personal experiences, albeit as a very young boy, of the little people, and because of that, I've always kind of thought that they were on a slightly different frequency to us. So they weren't actually physical beings, at least not on this frequency, if you see what I mean. So I don't know. I understand what you're saying. I'm going to pause there.
I'm not dismissing. I'm not dismissing for 1 minute that the Fae aren't little people that people have seen. My own great grandfather spoke to the leprechauns, the little people. I'm just saying the myth of the two Arthur de Danann might have its origins in the ancient culture. I'm not saying that there's not fae, there's not pixies, but that particular branch of mythology is identical to what happened in the ancient world. The two Arthur de Danann did go into the mounds. They did lose a battle, the elongated people, because towards the early Bronze Age, a lot of them were slaughtered by the beaker culture. It's fact after fact seems to appear to correlate to that myth. But I think there's far more paranormal experiences in this landscape that, occur and that people have seen, from plasma ball events to numerous other things. And the Fae proper, as in a mythological being, is different to an actual physical manifestation of something. I'm just looking at one branch of mythology and linking dots to what I think is a holy history.
Right. Okay. I get it. Yeah. So It also reminds me slightly of a book I read a few years ago by an Irish author called Conor McDarry, and the book is called Ancient Wisdom Preserved in the Bible and the Pyramids. And he was absolutely adamant that the Irish were the first global civilization, if you like, and they went around the world sharing their knowledge, etc. And I'm now just wondering if there's a connection here between that culture and the elongated skull people.
Well, if we think about Atlantis being in the Atlantic Ocean, I mean, there's arguments besides, but if we just follow that model and say, Pliny drew it, Pliny the Elder actually drew it there, and we say that you're a survivor from Atlantis, okay, and it was maybe a sudden event and you're, a survivor, then naturally the currents take you to the Bay of Sligo in Ireland. Now, that's a model that has been done, okay? That's saying that's where you would end up. And where do we have the oldest monuments in the British Isles? Sligo. So, I mean, you could join two dots there. I don't know if they were Atlanteans coming across. I don't know if they landed there. But what I do know is they are the most ancient sites in the British Isles, is undisputable.
Okay. Okay. So is there a relationship between the elongated skull people and the shape of the monuments, the megalithic monuments, the long barrows, etc.? Is there a connection there?
I think so, because when we go back to the very early archaeologists, and I say archaeologists rather than antiquarian, okay, because the antiquarians were like William Stukeley in 1724, that visited ancient sites, and John Aubrey as well in about 1666. So if we put those to one side and say the early archaeologists were very good because they were saying what they dug out at what depth. Yeah, so you have some kind of record. Then what we see in the archaeology of place is that the type of monument that they were digging from, yeah, they coined the phrase long-skulled people, long barrows, round-skulled people, round barrows. And they kept noticing that time and time again. And they were noticing that the elongated skulled people were very short. The women 4'9" and the men no more than 5'4". So they were short with these kind of strange looking skulls with a strange shape and strange ears, but they were quite short as well. And then they noticed round about 2000 BC, well, from 2500, but more around 2000 BC, Orthodox dating, that all the round barrows were being surrounding Stonehenge. Completely different culture. They didn't build Stonehenge. The ADNA says that from Dr. Ian Barnes. He's analysed the very tall Beaker culture and knows they did not build Stonehenge. It's impossible because they're much later. They're now Stonehenge is now 500 years old as we think we know it, and so this is what they noticed. And other monuments besides than the round skulls in the round barrows, and very tall, very stout, constantly being remarked upon, the really elongated monuments called the Cursors monument that stood in front of Stonehenge originally. It got ploughed out in around about 1727, 28. Fortunately, the antiquarian William Stukeley did draw it. So if you imagine standing in front of Stonehenge, a massive long monument, rectangular in shape, 1.75 miles long, with chalk banks possibly up to 10 feet high. But let's be conservative and say it's the same height of a chalk bank at a henge, about 6 feet. And they were also very elongated in shape. So I think the skulls inspired particular styles of burial.
Right. Okay. And there was so if we consider for a moment the elongated skull people in South America, who I assume were the builders of many of the megalithic sites out there, the culture that followed those people were the Incas, as I understand it, and as I understand it, the Incas venerate these megalithic builders. They respect them very greatly. But whereas in this country you have the elongated skull people, the Beaker people come along, and obviously resent them. But why did they resent them so much? What?
That's a really good question, and Brian Forrester points out in some of his books. He forwarded my book, actually, the Secret History of Stonehenge, and what he does point out is the more sophisticated, older monuments were probably done by the elongated, and then they became less sophisticated in his model and his research. Over here, there definitely was a barrier. Definitely, they did not mix for 500 years, and also what the Beaker culture did, they wanted to like eradicate their memory. So another question when I was in my 30s, late 30s, studying with Wessex archaeology was, why are all the long barrows decommissioned and closed down? Because what happened in 2500 BC had all of the long barrows were then infilled with dirt, few artifacts, bones placed in, and then sealed in with packing dirt really tightly. It was very hard for the archaeologists to dig out. And then huge standing stones blocking the entrance for all time. And the other elongated skulled monument, called a causeway enclosure, which is a series of ditches and banks with gaps in them, or called causeways, and they're circular. They were flattened as well. And this was occurring all across the British Isles. So we know that they probably didn't get on. Further, more so than that, rather, what I discovered through the writings of the late archaeologist Aubrey Burl is that some of these skulls were taken out, smashed to pieces, and then put back in at that same time frame of them being blocked off. Of whom I call the twice killed, because they died once and then it's a kind of effort to kill them again. The archaeological reasoning for that is because they contained bad spirits, and that so some of the skulls were smashed. Well, if they were all worried about the dead having bad spirits, well, then why wasn't that a practice throughout the British Isles? So we do know that they decommissioned the monuments. More so than that, let's go to Stonehenge itself. So all of this activities are taking place. Round barrows are replacing long barrows. And at Stonehenge itself, the first thing the Beaker culture did when they went there was they built a great big trench by the holiest of holies, the altar stones. I think there was more than one, and I can prove that actually. And so by the altar stones, they dug this big trench. Professor Mike Park Pearson discovered it quite recently, I think about sort of 10 years ago, wrote a whole paper on what was going on. Why was this trench dug by the holiest of holies? Well, I'm saying, and they don't know why. Well, I'm saying I think I do know why. It's because a different culture came in as agreement with Professor Ian Barnes, and they were destroying aspects of Stonehenge, and they uprooted some stones as well and desecrated other parts. It's almost like they were trying to make it theirs, and that's what Professor Ian Barnes says as well. They were taking over this monuments, if you look elsewhere like Avebury, and trying to lay claim to using these monuments.
Well, this happens in other parts of the world as well, doesn't it? Because, for example, in Egypt, there are monuments and megaliths in Egypt where cultures have come along afterwards and laid claim to the building and design of those monuments. So this would seem to be something that goes on a global, or has gone on a global scale.
Exactly, because it was there. I mean, you can't miss Stonehenge. It's there. You can't miss Avebury. But that was the Stonehenge phase 2, is the Stonehenge we're all familiar with, or we think we're familiar with. At Avebury, for example, 17 miles to the north of Stonehenge, phase 2 was Avebury had a big outer circle of 100 standing stones called the Great Stone Circle, or the Outer Stone Circle, inside of which there were 2 smaller stone circles. That was from phase 2. There was no avenues. Okay? So you have to think of monuments being built up over 1,000 years. And so phase 1 of the Neolithic period of Avebury wasn't stone at all. It was a huge, long timber structure, and that timber structure the archaeologists call a longhouse, and that's why you have the obelisk stone, the central stone of the southern inner circle, surrounded by a rectangular shape of standing stones, is depicting the most ancient feature at Avebury, which was, according to archaeologists, a longhouse. I'm saying it was a temple. It was a temple space. Why do I say it's a temple? Well, if people were living there, where's all the middens? Where's all the rubbish? It was a clean site. But they tend to call them long houses. So I think that was an occurrence there. And it was remembered from the descendants. They created phase one of Avebury. No avenues. That was just stone settings, phase one of the Neolithic after the timber structure. And there was another timber structure at Avebury further on down the avenue as well. So the avenue was very, very late at both Stonehenge and Avebury. They're not contemporary.
Right, okay. And so who is buried underneath the avenue at Avebury? Because I think you said that there are, or maybe there were ritual sacrifices at some point, and there are bodies underneath the avenue. So whose bodies are they? What culture were they?
They were the round skulled beaker culture, and they were all men. When you come to the end of the Bronze Age proper, and I mentioned the black moon, the black eclipse, very rare event. That's when you start to get ritual death practices. Whenever you have climate change, whether it's in Chaco Canyon, whether it's in the Mesoamerica, you get a response from humanity that's, I think, quite dark. But anyway, it is a response from humanity. And what they did at Avebury was they did ritually kill some people. There's evidence for that because people didn't hit, their wounds didn't heal. And same at Stonehenge, you have very strange burial practices on what's called boundary lines that they created for farming purposes, where they put men into the ground. It was almost like it was trying to create fertility. Maybe it represented the seed of creation again, because crops were, dying. And so that this response came literally out of the blue. It had never been an occurrence before.
Right, okay. Let's lighten the mood a little bit now then. Okay, I'm going to pause here because we're 47 minutes in, and I'm aware that I've asked you lots of questions, and I've not really let you have the floor or get into your flow about this book. So, is there anywhere that you'd like to take this? Is there anything we haven't covered with regards to the book?
Oh, we've only touched on the surface with the book. I mean, like I said, it's 390 pages long. I've spoken about chapter 1, chapter 2, and the last chapter, the end of the megalithic era. I cover a lot more besides that, can't really fill in a small interview. But what I would like to say is that when we come to the ancient history of this island, especially, and other places beside, that it is such an intimate association with ancient Egypt. Because one thing I noticed, I mean, when I wrote my first book, like I said, all I had was a skull to go on, and measurements, not the whole skeletal measurements. And I believed at that time that all of the killings of the murdered longskulled people were the result of a clash with the beaker people, the very tall people. When I started to reevaluate and get more and more research, then I realized that was just at the end of the Neolithic period. Prior to that, their burial practices were quite reflecting ancient Egypt, where in ancient Egypt, if a pharaoh died or a ruler as such, then often they would be accompanied by their serving classes. And that was round about 3000 BC. I'm using orthodox dating. And that was exactly the same in ancient Britain as well, because you had a burial that had showed no sign of disturbance to the skull or to the body, died a natural death or from causes unknown, obviously because the flesh has deteriorated, and they were placed in by probably the serving class. And we must remember, in that era, death wasn't how we perceive death now. And even in the Iron Age and the Viking Age, that happened as well, because it would be an honor to go with the ruler. So we kind of might think of that as being a bit macabre, but I don't think it was to these ancient people, because the practice happened time and again. And just when it kind of ended in the Egyptian period, we find it ended here as well. And this is why I'm doing a really big link to ancient Egypt. And I cover this in the first couple of chapters in the book about the burial practices of the ancient world akin to the ancient Egyptians.
Right, brilliant. Okay. I've pretty much run out of questions now, to be honest with you. I was going to ask you about the strange phenomena of radiation, high radiation levels on some of these monuments, and what's all that about, kind of thing.
Yes, we've detected at the sanctuary in Avebury, for example, that on the inside of what was a stone circle today is just marker stones that were depicting the places of the former standing stones, put there in the 1930s by Maud Cunnington, one of the first female archaeologists. And so we've got these marker stones depicting the former stone circle. At the center, we got much higher gamma radiation levels than on the outside of the stone circle. It was remarkable. You go outside of the stone circle, it dips down to the normal level. So maybe it was some kind of idea that you wanted to be around this type of radiation. Did it affect the longskulled people differently? We will never know. How were they using it for, a primitive form of RT, radiotherapy? Who knows? But what we do know is that was in occurrence. And same in Aberdeenshire. It was discovered by the Dragon Project, led by Paul Devereux, for instance, that particular stone circles there during the moon's metonic cycle, which we're coming up to now, we're in that phase once again, it would flare up at dawn, for example, when the moon was exactly to that point. Why would that be in occurrence? And the same at Stonehenge, in the middle of the Cursors monument, you have higher radiation levels. Could they sense it? How on earth did they know it was there? One thing I do point out in the first chapter of The Secret History of Stonehenge, because that's what we're focusing on now, was this fact. In the Mesolithic period, we are told that the people were hunter-gatherers. That's a little mantra that an archaeologist would tell you. That's in occurrence. But the first monuments to be erected in the ancient landscape, yes, were timber long structures and temples, but Mesolithic standing stones. We know that they were marking out particular aspects in the landscape. For one, we know that they were Mesolithic. Archaeologists have proved that because they were smashed in the Neolithic to make floors for the long barrows. So they stood, and in a long barrow, you often get what's called a chalk socket, which would fit a standing stone. Archaeologists can recognize them a mile away. And they were thinking, well, this is strange. In loads of long barrows, we have socket holes for standing stones. And look, we have stone floors made of sarsen stones. But I looked into the geology of where these standing stones were placed. And they're placed exactly where you have two different types of soil interface. What do I mean by that? If you imagine you've got chalk in the landscape that suddenly meets clay or green sand, you now got a changeover in geology, and that's where they were placing the standing stones, which, in geomantic terms is called an interface that can release energy. So they did in the Mesolithic, in my opinion, a geological survey of the British Isles.
Right, and that reminds me of Silbury Hill, the clay and the chalk, and how that was constructed. So that relates to that, doesn't it?
Yes, I mean this is natural in the landscape. At Silbury Hill, it was man-made to put up like that. But I mentioned earlier in this interview that I think that Silbury Hill could be dated to 12,000 BC. Okay. Why would I say that? Well, if you look to the base of Silbury Hill and you look to the artifacts that were placed there by presumably the people that constructed it, then they are all flint that can be dated to 12,000 BC. And that's at the very base. And what was also found at Silbury Hill, which is hardly ever spoken about, is the chamber at the bottom of Silbury Hill. It had a cutout. There's photographs of it in archaeological surveys, but
Right.
nobody speaks about the hidden chamber in Silbury Hill.
Did you gain access to that? Because I understand that you've been inside Silbury Hill, which I'm extremely jealous about.
No,
No?
no. That was just to show people what's called the old surface level, which I photographed. I did not go into the more sensitive excavation areas because the general public might deposit accidentally DNA, different types of things. They'll step on it. They don't know where to stand. So I understand at that point why the archaeological community did that, but they did release it like drip fed that about these hidden aspects of Silbury Hill. So if we say at the base, this is how they normally date it, you find anything at a base, that dates it. So you've got all of this evidence for 12,000 BC, contemporary with sites in Turkey, for example, and yet we say it's 2,480 BC, according to the so-called mound expert, Jim Leary.
Okay. I had a very interesting experience on one occasion when I climbed Silbury Hill. Got to the top, marvelled at the view, etc. And on my way back down, I started getting this static in my left ear. It was very strange, like a cackling, almost like interference with a radio station. It was very, very odd. Have you ever experienced anything like that yourself?
No, but I have been around people that have. That said, but personally, no, I haven't. I do think when it comes to the measurements that we did on top of Silbury Hill, and I think this is about chapter 6 in the book, I think the ancient world could produce light from large mounds. And with an engineer, we looked at the structural surfacing, layering of Silbury Hill, and we also look to the top of Silbury Hill. Today, you see it sliced off. That's because the Normans came along and they wanted a lookout and they sliced it off. It was more round to begin with. Yeah, so it's much smaller on the top than what you see it today in its original guise. And if you placed on the top of that mound a piece of copper, for example, and copper has been around since the Chalcolithic period, which preceded the Bronze Age here. So that's not beyond the bounds of possibility. What we noticed in the measurements at Silbury Hill, if you have a control at the bottom and you're on the top, the electrostatic field is near enough 1,000 times greater on the top. It is an anomaly. Now, whether that's coming in from the inside of Silbury Hill with the ions from the deep water coming up and charging it, theories can abound. But the fact was, we got that time and again, that particular one. Now you've got an electrostatic field that is building up. You put some literally copper or a piece of pointed copper in, then what would happen? It would start to glow a kind of bluish tinge, okay? A bluish tinge would be released from Silbury Hill. And that has been photographed by somebody in I think it was around the year 2000, maybe 2004, where one side of it at the full moon is producing this blue haze. They showed me the photograph, which I made a mock-up of in Photoshop. It's identical, but I don't have the moon in it. So we know that's been seen, vestiges of it. And that's because the mound's been so disturbed over the period of maybe thousands of years that it no longer functions like that. So we think they behave like a capacitor, if you will, Silbury Hill, and then it can release a static field that you could generate light.
Wow, that's amazing to consider. What that must have been like for somebody just, walking past there and seeing that. It must have blown them away.
Yes, and if you go to any large mound, and there's large mounds in Marlborough, and you've got Merlin's Mount, you've got Mardinhenge, which was the biggest henge monument in the British Isles, and it's exactly in the middle of Avebury and Stonehenge. That had a massive mound. Then if you go to the outskirts of Stonehenge, you've got the Enford Mound. That was huge, and you go to Derbyshire, you've got Gibb Hill next to Below. All of these could have been theoretically producing this blue light. Like I said, that was an engineer that calculated it with me, who took the electrostatic measurements from Silbury Hill. You have to have that going on. You'd have to have that there, but you only got to go 6 feet above the ground surface, and the electrostatic field starts to change, especially if you had cloud cover, electro energy in the form of lightning or storm. That would increase it even more.
Wow, incredible. Maria, my head is spinning. We've just passed the hour mark. This is incredible. I'm really looking forward to reading the book. I can't wait now. And I must have you back on to discuss it once I've read it, because I'm bound to have lots more questions. Can I ask you, what are your plans for this year?
My plans for this year are I'm going to do Douse in Ancient America in Charco Canyon. That's August the 24th and the 25th. And I still got some places on that. I've got workshops in Glastonbury and Avebury this year. And if you go to my website, the aveburyexperience.co.uk, all of my courses are there. I've got professional dowsing course at Avebury as well. And I'm also delving into the magic squares of antiquity at Glastonbury as well. And I've got a whole section on magic squares in my book. It's the basis of numerology and feng shui. Lo Shu, the Saturn square. And I'm having workshops with that. So also I'm going to Gaia-sphere to talk about ancient civilizations and my research there. So it should be a good year. And on September the 4th, I'll be going to Egypt with Kerry Cassidy. She's my partner for going to Egypt. And this year I'm doing something really different with the Bases Project. I'm with Miles Johnston from the Bases Project on May the 18th and 19th. And we're going to Rendlesham. Miles has got some information pre the normal activity of the 80s, going back to the 70s, and strange practices that were being done in the Second World War at Rendlesham. And that's the first day. And the second day, I'm going to be taking people to the ancient sites of Sutton Hoo. We're going to be looking at Vikings burials and how the Vikings did different earth energies, which we haven't had time to touch upon here. They were using the same earth energies that were later adopted by the royal families themselves at Westminster Abbey and Habsburg dynasty of Vienna fame.
Wow. So not much then. Brilliant. Wow. Okay. All that will be linked underneath the video. Maria, thank you so much for your time and your incredible knowledge on these subjects. My head is spinning, as I said. So can't wait to talk to you again. Thank you everyone for watching. Please like, share and subscribe, and check out Maria's amazing website, The Avebury Experience. There is so much more information on there. Thank you, Maria.
Thank you.